In 1945, the international system that emerged from the ruins of the Second World War was not built as a neutral or altruistic project. It was, above all, an architecture of power, the United States, as the dominant industrial, financial, and military force of the time, designed a world order that would stabilize global politics while quietly embedding American primacy into its foundations. The United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the framework of modern international law were not meant to eliminate power politics. They were meant to organize it, channel it, and most importantly, legitimize it. For decades, this system worked remarkably well for Washington. The United States did not rule the world through direct empire in the classical sense. Instead, it ruled through rules. The dollar became the core of the global financial system. Security alliances placed much of the industrial world under the American strategic umbrella. International institutions, while formally multilateral, were structurally aligned with U.S. preferences. Law, norms, and procedure did not restrain American power. They amplified it by making it appear predictable, lawful, and broadly acceptable. This was not a world without contradictions. The United States repeatedly violated the principles it claimed to defend. It intervened in foreign governments, waged wars without clear legal mandates, and applied international law selectively. But the crucial point is that it never tried to destroy the system itself. On the contrary, it invested heavily in preserving the legitimacy of the system, even when it quietly bent or broke its rules. Hypocrisy was not a bug of the order. It was a feature that allowed the system to survive. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the peak of this arrangement. The so-called unipolar moment created the illusion that American dominance had become a permanent condition rather than a historical phase. With no peer competitor, the United States could expand its alliances, rewrite trade rules, and intervene militarily with limited resistance. International institutions increasingly functioned as instruments for managing a world that had only one true center of gravity. But systems built around a single pole depend on one critical assumption, that no alternative centers of power will emerge. That assumption is now visibly false. Over the past 2 decades, the global distribution of power has been shifting in slow but irreversible ways. China has become an industrial and technological giant. Russia, while weaker economically, has reasserted itself as a military and geopolitical actor. Large parts of the global south are seeking strategic autonomy rather than permanent alignment. Regional powers are no longer willing to accept a world in which rules are written elsewhere and applied to them selectively. This shift does not mean the United States has become weak. It remains the most powerful single actor in the system. But it does mean that the system no longer automatically produces outcomes that favor Washington. And that is the core of the current crisis. Institutions that once served as force multipliers for American power are increasingly becoming arenas of resistance, delay, and negotiation. International law, which once provided a language of legitimacy, is now more frequently invoked against the United States and its allies. Multilateral bodies, instead of rubber-stamping decisions, are more often fragmented, contested, or paralyzed. In strategic terms, the United States is facing a new and uncomfortable reality. The rules-based system it built is starting to constrain it. Historically, the American response to such constraints was selective circumvention. When rules were inconvenient, they were ignored. When institutions were obstructive, they were bypassed. But the overall structure was preserved, because it still served a larger purpose, maintaining global leadership at relatively low cost. What is changing now is not merely behavior, but attitude. A growing current within us strategic thinking no longer sees the existing international system as a tool to be managed, but as an obstacle to be removed. The language has begun to shift from leadership to freedom of action, from legitimacy to leverage, from institutions to deals. This is not a sudden revolution. It is the result of a long accumulation of frustrations inside a system that no longer guarantees automatic dominance. From this perspective, the problem is not that the rules are being violated. The problem is that the rules exist at all. This marks a profound psychological and strategic transition. The post-war order was built on the assumption that American power would be greatest when it was embedded in institutions. The emerging view is that American power is safest when it is unconstrained by them. This does not mean the United States is abandoning power politics. It always practiced power politics. The difference is that it is now increasingly willing to abandon the language, the rituals, and the structures that once made those politics predictable and containable. In earlier eras, Washington insisted on the importance of international law, even when it quietly undermined it. Influential voices openly question whether international law should have any authority over American decisions at all. This is not merely rhetorical excess. It reflects a deeper reassessment of costs and benefits in a world where compliance no longer guarantees control. The central thesis begins to take shape here. The United States is no longer primarily trying to dominate the system it created. It is increasingly preparing to escape it. This is not a minor adjustment. It is a systemic break. Because a rules-based order once abandoned by its principal architect does not simply weaken. It loses its reason to exist. And if the strongest power in the system starts treating the system itself as optional, the question is no longer how the rules will be enforced. The question becomes what replaces them. The strategy of exit, dismantling institutions, normalizing power politics once the international system is no longer perceived as an advantage. The logic of participation changes. What begins as frustration gradually becomes strategic reassessment. What follows is not accidental erosion, but deliberate withdrawal. In recent years, the behavior of the United States toward multilateral institutions has started to reflect precisely this shift. The pattern is not chaotic. It's consistent, cumulative, and revealing. The United States has reduced funding, blocked appointments, withdrawn from treaties, and paralyzed dispute resolution mechanisms across a wide range of international bodies. Arms control agreements have been abandoned or left to decay. Trade adjudication systems have been rendered dysfunctional. Global health, environmental, and cultural institutions have faced either direct exit or quiet suffocation through neglect. Each individual move can be explained away as tactical or political. Taken together, they form a coherent strategy, the systematic lowering of institutional constraints on American freedom of action. From a narrow perspective, this strategy is rational. Multilateral institutions are designed to create veto points. They slow decisions. They force compromises. They create reputational costs. In a world where the United States could reliably set the agenda, these costs were manageable. In a world where outcomes are increasingly negotiated, contested, or blocked, these same mechanisms become strategic liabilities. International law in particular introduces three forms of friction that are now viewed with growing suspicion in Washington. First, legal processes consume time. Second, they expose decisions to external judgment. Third, they create precedents that can later be used by others. For a power that increasingly defines its security in terms of speed, surprise, and unilateral leverage, all three are undesirable. The deeper problem is not that the United States suddenly discovered that institutions can be inconvenient. It is that the structure of the international system is no longer aligned with American preferences. Multipolarity transforms rules from tools into obstacles. Procedures that once disciplined weaker states now constrain stronger ones. Norms that once stabilized hierarchy now facilitate resistance. In this environment, the strategic calculus changes. If rules no longer reliably serve power, then power seeks to free itself from rules. This is where the current shift differs from earlier periods of American unilateralism. In the past, Washington bypassed institutions while preserving their legitimacy. Today, it is increasingly willing to question the legitimacy of the institutions themselves. The objective is no longer to bend the system, but to make it irrelevant. This is visible in the language of strategic discourse. Concepts such as great power competition and spheres of influence have returned to the center of policy thinking. These are not legal concepts. They belong to a world in which geography, coercion, and hierarchy matter more than treaties or universal norms. In such a world, influence is not adjudicated. It is asserted. What had previously been expressed in careful diplomatic language was suddenly stated with unusual directness. International law was no longer treated as a shared framework, but as an optional instrument. Multilateralism was no longer portrayed as a source of legitimacy, but as a constraint imposed by others. This rhetorical bluntness shocked many observers, but it did not represent a complete rupture with earlier practice. It represented a reduction in pretense. Beneath the surface, a broad continuity can be observed across administrations, growing skepticism toward binding commitments, growing preference for bilateral pressure, and growing impatience with procedural limits. The strategic doctrine that emerges from this pattern has three core principles. First, freedom of action is prioritized over legal or institutional legitimacy. Second, coercion is favored over consensus. Third, unpredictability is treated as a tool of deterrence rather than a risk to stability. In theory, this approach offers certain short-term advantages. It allows faster decisions. It reduces the ability of others to block initiatives. It maximizes leverage in asymmetric relationships. But it also carries a structural cost that is often underestimated. It destroys the expectation of rule-based behavior. Once that expectation erodes, the entire environment changes. Agreements become temporary. Commitments become conditional. Every actor begins to plan not around shared frameworks, but around worst-case scenarios. There is also a more dangerous consequence: precedent. If the most powerful state in the system treats rules as optional, then no other state has a rational incentive to treat them as binding. The logic spreads outward. Regional powers begin to test boundaries. Revisionist ambitions become easier to justify. The difference between enforcement and imitation starts to blur. In such a world, the line between order and disorder is not crossed in a single moment. It dissolves gradually through accumulation of exceptions, withdrawals, and special cases. It is important to understand that this process is not driven by ideology alone. It is driven by a structural fear, the fear of being constrained in a system that can no longer be controlled. From this perspective, dismantling institutional limits is not seen as recklessness, but as preemptive self-defense. Yet this is where the strategy reveals its deepest contradiction. Institutions are not merely restraints. They are also shock absorbers. They slow escalation. They provide channels for negotiation. They reduce miscalculation. By weakening them, the United States is not only freeing itself, it is also removing the mechanisms that made its own dominance relatively stable and inexpensive. The world that emerges from this strategy is not a world of restored hierarchy. It is a world of exposed power, constant testing, and permanent strategic tension. And once that world takes shape, it does not remain confined to any single administration or doctrine. It becomes the new, operating environment for everyone. At that point, the question is no longer whether the old rules can be repaired. The question is whether anyone will still believe in them. When the principal architect of a system begins to treat that system as optional, the consequences extend far beyond the intentions of any single government. International orders do not collapse because someone announces their end. They collapse because the expectations that sustain them slowly disappear. Once that process begins, the structure does not revert to an earlier equilibrium. It reorganizes into something more primitive, more volatile, and far harder to control. The first casualty of a world without widely respected rules is predictability. In a rules-based environment, states can plan on the assumption that certain actions will trigger certain responses, that certain boundaries will not be crossed without warning or cost. When law and institutions lose authority, that assumption erodes. Trade relations, sanctions regimes, investment flows, shipping routes, and even currency arrangements become subject not to shared frameworks, but to shifting power calculations. This does not produce freedom, it produces permanent uncertainty. In such an environment, every significant actor is forced to adopt a worst-case planning mentality. If agreements are no longer reliable, they must be treated as temporary pauses rather than stable arrangements. If institutions no longer provide credible arbitration, disputes must be settled through leverage or threat. The result is a classic security dilemma. Each side's defensive preparations appear offensive to others, and each response generates another round of countermeasures. History suggests where this leads. Military spending rises not because war is desired, but because it can no longer be confidently avoided. Arms control becomes impossible when verification mechanisms are distrusted or dismantled. Nuclear and advanced conventional weapons begin to look less like last resort deterrents and more like standard tools of strategic insurance. At the same time, the erosion of neutral institutions removes the few remaining spaces where rival powers can interact without, immediately turning every disagreement into a test of strength. There are no trusted referees. There are no universally accepted procedures for de-escalation. Crises that would once have been contained through legal or diplomatic channels increasingly become confrontations, managed through signals, ultimatums, and demonstrations of force. This environment also accelerates fragmentation. Instead of one global system with shared rules, the world begins to divide into competing blocks, each with its own standards, financial channels, technological ecosystems, and security arrangements. Interdependence does not disappear, but it becomes weaponized. Trade, investment, and access to infrastructure are no longer primarily economic instruments. They become tools of pressure. The promise of universality, the idea that the same basic rules apply to everyone, gives way to a patchwork of overlapping and often incompatible systems. For smaller and medium-sized states, this is not a liberation. It is a constraint. They are forced to choose alignments not based on development strategies or legal commitments, but based on survival calculations. In this kind of world, power is more visible, but also more brittle. Influence must be constantly demonstrated because it is no longer embedded in stable structures. Coercion replaces coordination. Policing replaces leadership. The cost of maintaining any form of order rises sharply because nothing is taken for granted. This is the point at which a crucial illusion breaks down. The idea that dismantling the rules-based order automatically benefits the strongest power. In reality, a system without widely accepted rules is not cheaper to dominate. It is more expensive. It requires continuous pressure, constant attention, and frequent displays of force. It also produces more resistance because there are fewer incentives for others to accept hierarchy voluntarily. Legitimacy, once lost, cannot be replaced by power alone. It can only be substituted, imperfectly and temporarily, by intimidation. For the United States, this creates a strategic paradox. By weakening the institutions that once stabilized its dominance, it may gain short-term freedom of action, but it also inherits a world in which every commitment is fragile and every region is a potential flashpoint. Instead of managing a system, it must manage a series of crises. And crises, by definition, do not remain confined to the plans of those who trigger them. The deeper danger is not any single conflict or confrontation. It is systemic. A world without trusted rules has fewer brakes and more accelerators. Mistakes travel faster. Misinterpretations are harder to correct. Escalation becomes easier than restraint, not because leaders are irrational, but because the environment rewards speed and punishes hesitation. What is being dismantled, therefore, is not simply a set of institutions or legal texts. It is the shock-absorbing layer of the international system, the mechanisms that once turned rivalries into managed competitions instead of uncontrolled collisions. The central warning is this: no major power, no matter how strong, can fully control a system defined by permanent instability. Power can shape such a world, but it cannot pacify it. In seeking to escape the constraints of the old order, the United States is not entering a vacuum. It is helping to create a new environment, one in which strength matters more, but security matters less. This is not the end of global order. It is the beginning of a harsher, riskier, and more fragmented one. And once that transformation is complete, no single country will be able to decide where the consequences stop. That rule isn't just a restriction. It's part of a complex system that protects us from the chaos of a world where only power matters. Our rules aren't perfect, and we should always work to make them better and more just. But a world without them isn't freedom, it's a prison of fear. Thanks for watching. What rule do you think is the most important for society? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos that make you think. See you next time.